Just give it a second to make certain the record. So welcome everyone. I can't believe it's already August. We're delighted to have folks back on the task force. And, just as a reminder, in the spirit of equity, really encouraging people to bring your comments and your thoughts into the group so everyone can hear them. And as a reminder that everybody can't always see chat, either because of the technology that they have or for other reasons. So just encouraging everyone we should have plenty of time again today to discuss things. But if you have a technical question, that is something that you assume most of the folks in the group know, but you don't understand a zoning term or something that was just referenced, that's a perfect place to use chat and allow the staff to answer those more technical questions, because we know that some of you, like our planning board members, can probably quote code all day long, and others of us need a little more explanation from time to time. And so we're so delighted to have everyone with us. And because, we still have Brandon, who is getting to know us all, and we're all, we don't get to do this in person. We're going to start where we always do, with some introductions. So Yvonne, I'm going to kick it to you for going ahead with introductions.
Before I get started, somebody moved Flor. Thank you for that. I was trying to move her to a panelist. And I did see that there was another Yvonne in the group, so I'm not sure why. Zoom seems to really want multiples of me in this meeting. But if you do see my name come across your screen, feel free to change your name so that I make sure that you count you in the attendance.
I love it for Bruce to be you, Yvonne.
It happens every time. So Yvonne, my apologies for I'm a poor impersonator.
It is okay. Trust me, you don't want to be me. I'm a little neurotic. So please introduce yourself with your name and the organization you are with. For our new CPD staff member, Brandon, so that he gets to know a little bit. He gets to know the task force a little bit more. We'll start with Flor Alvidres, followed by Geraldine if she hops on the call.
Hello, I'm Flor Alvidres, and I'm not really with an organization. I'm more as a resident. My background is in construction and real estate, though, so I'm pretty familiar with zoning in general. And I'm in Athmar Park, where I grew up.
Thank you, Flor. I don't see Geraldine, so we'll skip to Claudia Folska, followed by Brandon.
Hi, I'm Claudia Folska. I'm a former elected official for the RTD board. I'm a small business owner, and my doctorate is in architecture planning and cognitive science.
Thank you, Claudia. Is Alfonso with us? Alfonso Espino?
Didn't see him yet.
Haven't seen him hop on. And Brendan Green isn't with us either. Man, we are missing quite a bit of you all. Steve Harley.
Hi there, Steve Harley. I'm here reporting back to the Baker Historic Neighborhood Association, but also bringing my own perspectives.
Thank you. Let's go to Monica Martinez or Lindsay Miller.
Hi, Monica Martinez. I run the Fax Partnership. Sorry, I missed a couple meetings this summer. It was a busy summer. So nice to see everybody again.
Thank you. And I see Lindsay Miller is hopping on.
Hello, Lindsay Miller with Beyond Growth Strategies.
Thank you. Joel Noble, followed by Bruce O'Donnell.
Hi, everyone. Joel Noble. I'm a past president of Curtis Park Neighbors, and I currently serve on the Denver Planning Board.
Thank you.
Hi, everybody. Bruce O'Donnell. I got my name changed, and I'm with Starboard Realty, and we do a lot of rezoning and entitlement and planning work in the city.
Thank you. Caitlin Quander and Lou Raiders.
Hi, Caitlin Quander, and I'm a land use attorney in town, so often guide both small and big businesses and real estate clients through rezoning processes.
You.
Hi, everyone. Lou Raiders. I'm a retired real estate and structured finance lawyer, and I'm currently the president of Cherry Creek North and chair of the Cherry Creek Steering Committee.
Thank you. Shara Smith, followed by Robin Wood Mason.
Good afternoon, everyone. Shara Smith, she, her. I'm the Executive Director of the Interfaith Alliance of Colorado.
Hi, everyone. Robin Wood Mason, he, him pronouns, and I am the CEO of Community Shares of Colorado.
And Kate, I think I may have skipped over you, but can you please introduce yourself?
Sure. Kate Hilberg with Habitat for Humanity, and I've got a screaming toddler in the house, so I'm gonna try to stay muted as much as possible.
Okay. Are any of our council members with us? I haven't seen them. Just want to make sure I don't skip over them. All right. Well, thank you so much for introducing yourselves. I'll pass it along to Brandon Schaefer with CPD.
Hi, everyone. I'm Brandon Shaver with CPD. I'll pass it off to Liz.
Hi, everybody. Good to see you. Liz Weigel with the project team, and I'm the rezoning supervisor. And I'll throw it to Andrew.
Hello, everyone. Andrew Webb here, also with Community Planning and Development and part of the project team. Passing it off to Rob, I believe.
Thanks, Andrew. Hello, everybody. Again, Rob Haig, member of the CPD project team and part of the rezoning team as well. Thanks. I think that's all for CPD staff today.
Thank you. And we will introduce ourselves as well. My name is Yvonne Miranda. I'm with the Strategy with Rocks consulting team. I am the project manager and project coordinator, and you'll see lots of communication come from us. I'll pass it over to Rox, our fierce leader.
Thanks. I'm Roxanne White. I go by Rox, and delighted to be here with you all. And Sabrina.
Hi, everyone. Sabrina White. I'm the strategic project manager with Strategy with Rocks, and am happy to be here as well. And we will loop back around. We have a few more panelists hopping in right now. So I believe Maggie just joined.
Hi there. Good afternoon. My name's Maggie Lee, she, her, and I am in strategic partnerships and programs with the Neighborhood Development Collaborative.
Thank you. And I see Brittany just joined us as well. Brittany, your name and your organization.
She may be having trouble getting her volume and everything going. So,
okay.
Well, it's good to have her. And Brandon, I think we are now finally at a place where the hope was by August, you would have gotten rid of some of your other assignments and be able to devote more time to the task force. And I know from our prep sessions, that's certainly been the case. So do you mind just telling people a little bit more about yourself and where we're going today? And then we'll start on into the materials.
Yeah. Yes, that sounds great. Thank you, Roxanne. Thank you all for joining us again today. I'm really excited to be part of this team. And again, just wanted to share a little bit more about myself and my interest in this project. So I was born and raised in Denver. I was born at a hospital that is no longer where it was at 9th and Colorado. And I currently live in the San Rafael district of 5 Points. I'm really big into Denver history, and so therefore I'm really thankful to live in a neighborhood filled with it. So as I watched our city grow and change in the 2000s, kind of dating myself there, but that's when I became extremely interested in urban planning and development and changed my college path, and I have been with CPD for about 6.5 years now. While working here, I've had the opportunity to work on small area plans and citywide plans, text changes to our zoning code, and I've also managed a large number of rezonings at different scales across the whole city. So I feel strongly that rezoning is an important tool to help Denverites realize the vision for the future of their neighborhoods. And I think that if we all have a better understanding of and access to the rezoning process, it really can help us create more positive and equitable outcomes as our city evolves. So through the duration of this project, please don't hesitate to reach out to me. And thank you so much for the critical role that you all play on this force. So with that, I will go ahead and bring up our presentation. 1 second, please.
Okay, you're there. Yeah, there you go.
Got it. Okay, so first and foremost, going back to our timeline, you'll see that we are quickly coming to the end of summer, believe it or not, for good or bad. And we're going to be soon moving into the next phase of this project, which will be identifying a preferred approach. So for today's meeting, we'd briefly like to review the feedback that we've heard from previous task force meetings before we dive into a review of Denver's rezoning criteria. We'll follow this by a scenario discussion, and then hopefully end the meeting with you all helping us identify areas of opportunity as they relate to the review criteria and to this project as a whole. So to give everyone a sense of where we're headed, we previously discussed the goals and objectives of this project, the issues and opportunities related to the rezoning process and advancing equity. And we have more recently discussed potential solutions for topics such as public awareness, consideration of public input, and the process for applicants. Just to keep you guys on the loop, we are going to be releasing a CPD's issue identification report, which is going to be finalized in the coming weeks and then shared with this group and posted to our project website. This report will take into account all the feedback that we received thus far, and then it clearly lays out the issues that we've discussed in these meetings, as well as criteria that we'll be using to develop successful solutions. And that'll be really helpful for us to compare recommendations against as we move forward. Lastly, I want to thank the task force for agreeing to the additional meetings. We have one next month and in December. This is really helping us be more thoughtful with our presentations to you all. And I think it's giving us a little bit more time to gather public input at strategic points in the project. So with that, I'll hand it over to Rox to get us started.
Great, thanks, Brandon. And for people who aren't as familiar with CPD, thanks for reminding us that your process is normally to have kind of an interim report with the issues before we get on to the recommendations. So that'll be great to see next month. But just as a reminder of where we've been, we have spent quite a bit of time on public input and public awareness and noticing. And so we may have some inclination to go back to those topics today. And I'm going to try to help us stay focused on the criteria today, because we have great input from you all, both from last meeting on public meetings and from the two meetings that we focused on noticing. And staff are working on that and following up on that and looking at other cities in more in depth and taking the next steps on that. So I know it seems like, because we don't meet except once a month, except for next month when we're going to meet twice, that it's been a while. It has been a while, but I assure you that those comments and good thinking has not been dropped or forgotten about. So today we're going to move into criteria. And many of you have been asking about when we're going to get there. And today is the day for really looking at the criteria. And then going forward, where are we going in September? Why do we need 2 meetings? Remember, we're making up for some lost time and to allow us to have a little more discussion. We're going to be talking about equitable outcomes and how has the city been looking at equitable outcomes so that we can give input into how we can improve that process. So Brandon, let's go ahead and go to the next slide. So follow-up that's happening right now. We are exploring additional opportunities outside of the public hearings for the public to connect with rezoning and to ensure that people know about the rezoning, right? We're working on making certain that that criteria for the public input is easier to understand. And really looking at, you all mentioned tailoring staff's evaluation of review criteria to reflect the site-specific conditions. So that, as you remember, there's a staff recommendation that happens and making certain that that is happening. And broadening the notice area. Who is engaged? How do we engage? How do we engage in multiple languages? How do we engage for people who are accessing the information in other forums and other ways? and additional email and noticing. So you remember when we talked about tenants and should tenants be notified and that sort of work. So all of that is underway at this point, and CPD is working on that so that when we get to a place of recommendations, the staff can come to us with, this is their thinking about what could be done given the resources we have. This could be done if we had more resources. This is feasible, but the attorneys can't stand it. Those sorts of things that we have to think about. So remember last meeting, Councilwoman Sandoval and Sita talked in particular, and Joel mentioned as well a bit about how do we make certain that whatever we do is defensible. And so that's where we've been moving us and the work that's underway as we move on into the next section about the criteria. So Brandon and Liz are going to walk us through the criteria, and then we're going to have an opportunity again to delve into a scenario and think about, based on what the information we have, what works, what needs to be improved, that sort of thing. So Brandon, I'm going to turn it back to you and start walking us through the criteria, and hang with us. It's a little dense to start with, but we promise you we're going to do two things. One is go through all the criteria, and secondly, work on how it gets applied. So both the facts and the actuality of it. And welcome as well. We had a couple more folks join us. So welcome Councilwoman Sandoval, welcome Alfonso. We're glad you made it as well. Just a second ago, we spent a little more time on introductions because Brandon is now much more involved in this project and the lead on the project. So Brandon, turning it to you.
Great, thank you, Rox. And thanks for listening to us, everyone that could have little dense at moments, so please bear with us. To help give everyone a really good understanding of the review criteria, it's really helpful for us to start with the purpose of rezoning review criteria, and then we'll walk through the 5 that Denver uses, and then again use a scenario to prompt that discussion. We'll then have a discussion of what improvements could be made to the criteria and how they could be better understood. So we see that there's 4 key purposes of rezoning review criteria. The first is to ensure compliance with our city charter. The second is to ensure that decisions to approve or deny rezonings are constitutional by not being arbitrary or capricious. 3, to give everyone a shared and predictable understanding of how final decisions will be made. And 4th, to define the level of discretion and flexibility in decision making. As we keep that in our minds, let's move to Denver's review criteria. So it's important to remember that these 5 review criteria live in our zoning code. These are the review criteria that city staff, planning board, and city council use to evaluate a rezoning request. As we've covered in previous meetings, any public comments that are received are considered as they relate to these 5 criteria. Also keep in mind that the zoning code is a binding legal document that exists just within a framework of larger city codes and our city charter. So it is important for us to keep many of these criteria in our zoning code, and we will be consulting with city attorneys on any updates that we propose. Before Liz walks through each one of these individually, I'd also like to point out that the last 2 criteria, justifying circumstances and consistency with neighborhood context, zone district purpose, and intent statements, are only required for non-legislative applicant-driven rezoning requests. Keep in mind that the majority of rezonings that we see in Denver are applicant-driven, and therefore will need to meet all 5 criteria. So I'll kick it to Liz to get us started.
Great, thanks, Brandon. So I'm going to walk through each of the criteria. Those of you who attended our orientation back in, was it February? I think it was. So we walked through them there. So this will be some familiarity from that presentation. And obviously I know that some of you work with these very regularly, but we're going to spend some time just to walk through each of them. And yeah, thanks for your patience, because we know this is probably our most technical piece of all of our conversations. So the first criteria really is called consistency with adopted plans. And, this is where we really look to the plans that often are developed over years-long processes, both at the citywide level and at the neighborhood level, have had, a significant amount of community input and review. And these plans were ultimately adopted by city council and set that official policy for the work of the city. And they provide the guidance for planners and decision makers as we move forward about how the city should grow or develop. So any rezoning that comes in really needs to be found consistent with these plans to ensure that it implements their goals and their policies. As many of you know, in some places we have multiple plans that are applicable. So we might have our citywide plan like Blueprint Denver, and then also have a neighborhood plan or an area plan that we're looking to. And it's important to really look at the proposal and compare it to all of those plans. And it's not always straightforward. We're often looking at various policies and making a recommendation. And just a reminder, this comes at the end of our process now, right? So there's been the application made, the noticing has happened, and like when the public hearings are happening is when this evaluation comes both from staff and then ultimately city council has the final vote in considering these. So we're kind of taking that analysis and looking at what the districts allow, the district that's proposed, and comparing it to what our plans have recommended. Go to the next one. I also wanted to pause here and speak to how equity fits into our criteria now. Our adopted plans have equity guidance within them, both in our comprehensive plan with particularly this vision element number 1, which speaks to equity, affordability, and making sure that our city is inclusive going forward. And in Blueprint Denver, we've touched on these before, these specific equity concepts that speak to reducing displacement and improving access to opportunity and making sure we have a diversity of jobs and housing in all of our neighborhoods. So every rezoning is looked at in comparison to these equity goals in our citywide plans. And to the extent they are also in a neighborhood plan, we would be looking to those as well. So we make that comparison of what the district would allow and how it matches up with the goals of the city. And we will spend a little bit more time at the next meeting talking about what some of the work we've been doing on larger rezonings and in our more vulnerable neighborhoods to do an even deeper dive into these equity concepts and work with the applicant in addressing them. Go to the next one. So this next one, which is called Uniformity of District Regulations. And this can also be found in our city charter. So one of our constraints here is that we have some of these pieces also in other parts of our regulations. But this one's a little bit wonky, and it means essentially that when we rezone a district, that the districts that we're rezoning into is applied the same way throughout the city. So it's consistent. A CMX8, that's one of our districts, is the rules for one property in one neighborhood are the same as the rules for a property in another neighborhood. So how high the building can be and what the setbacks are, that we're really being consistent in our rules as they apply to places that we've zoned similarly. So essentially, because we have a zoning code and we have rules in each district, typically we would make a recommendation that this criteria is met, because we know that we're applying a district that we have standard regulations within. Go to the next one. So this next, the third criteria is around furthering public health, safety, and general welfare. As many of you know, there's really a rich history of zoning regulations of the city's work, that really everything we're doing as a city should be furthering public health, safety, and welfare. So this comes to when we're writing our plans, they need to be doing that. When we write our zoning laws, they need to do that. And we have to find that as we adopt those various regulations or plans, that we really are looking out for the public good. So at the time of for a rezoning, we would look to whether the district is furthering those adopted plans. So like, it's a little bit of an extension. I think in some of the frustration we hear sometimes around this one is that it feels repetitive with the first criteria, so that if it is meeting our adopted plans, it is thereby also furthering public health, safety, and general welfare. Oftentimes, applications will also speak to how the standards of the zone district might improve the built environment, say better relationship with the sidewalk. Those types of things speak to the district standards about how those improve public health, safety, and general welfare. But this one sometimes leads to confusion and frustration about what it really means and how is it different than consistency with adopted plans. Let's stick to the next one. So as Brandon mentioned, for applicant-driven rezonings, which is the majority of our rezonings today in the city, the applicant must also meet this fourth criteria, which really they're demonstrating that there's a compelling reason or what's called a justifying circumstance for why the zoning should be changed on this site. If you click, Brandon, I just wanted to see if that next box comes up. So there's a number of circumstances that are outlined in the code as ones that might be a reason. A number of them are around an error or a mistake of fact. So something was wrong when the district got mapped that we need to correct, or that we didn't somehow consider, say, like very difficult development constraints on a property. We also have another one, E, there, that is about when it's appropriate to apply like additional regulations. Some of you might be aware of what we call overlays, which means that we're adding a special regulation there. Councilwoman Sandoval's on here, and she worked a lot on a active uses overlay in the Tennyson area, and that's a place where we added an additional regulation. So it's a new district we've created, and we're adding it there. But the one that gets used most often is the fourth one here, or D on this list, which is about changing conditions. And we did make an update to this in 2018 to try to clarify this one. And it speaks to potential changes that this could justify this. And it's really, if you think about it, so it's written in a way that it's a change that has happened since the current zoning was put in place. So if you've had your zoning since 2010, what changes have happened that justify rethinking the zoning on the site?
So Liz, can you give us a
yeah,
couple
sure.
of examples,
Yeah,
both on development constraints and on changing conditions? Great.
Yeah, and I think the next slide goes into that. But development constraints, I would just say, again, we very rarely have that one be used. But you could think of maybe it was a very steeply sloping site, and a large part of it is not really developable. And maybe someone says, well, I should have the ability to kind of do more in my portion of the site based on that. That's just like hypothetically something that could come up there about not thinking about or not being aware, because zoning is broad for the city, being aware of some particular constraint on that property. For D, if we click to the next slide, so this is the changing conditions one. And so that's more of the language there. So it's since the existing zoning was established, there's been a change to a degree that the rezoning is in the public interest. So there's a reason, given these changing conditions, that we should consider different zoning for the site. And remember, keep in mind that this is in the context of all the other criteria also being met as well. And the first one is around changing conditions. So a more straightforward example of this would be a light rail station has been built in the area. Maybe that wasn't anticipated at the time that the zoning had been put in place. And that's a place now there's more opportunity potentially for people to live close to the transit station and have access to that. And that could be a change that's happened in a neighborhood that we should, warrants thinking about whether we have the right zoning there. B is a city adopted plan. So this would be, maybe you've had your zoning in place since 2010 again, but there was an area plan in 2015 that envisioned something different happening in this area. And so that's happened since your zoning was put in place. And so you're calling out that there's a new plan. And really it should be tied to what you're asking for, right? The new plan called for something different than what's there today. And so the request is to follow that's plan's guidance. The last one is, and I think we've touched on this, that portion of our city is still in our, what we call former chapter 59. So when we updated the zoning in 2010, there were some parcels or property that weren't brought along with that rezoning. And so there's still some that are still in our old code, don't have our up-to-date zoning regulations, and really our policy guidance is that we want to bring everybody into the new code. So if there's a property that's still in that old code, that's a reason that we would certainly consider and support bringing them into the current zoning regulations. So this next and fifth criteria is called consistency with neighborhood context description, zone district purpose, and intent statements. So if we look to our zoning code, we've got one example here for each of our neighborhood contexts, and that you remember all the way back to Rob's presentation in the orientation, we've got context from suburban and all the way up to downtown, and it's just talking about the general neighborhood characteristics. We have purpose statements describing what those contexts should be like, and we also have intent statements for each zone district. So this example here of a mixed use 8-story district talks about where it should be applied and the types, the scale of buildings that should be included. Sometimes you'll see building forms listed in these that are appropriate. And what we're doing and looking at this criteria is comparing, again, looking at how well this matches up with our adopted plans and the desired district of this site. So really matching up is, in this example, do we have an arterial street in the vicinity that's serving this site? Does these heights match up with what we're seeing in our adopted plans? Does the characteristics of this neighborhood context make sense for what is recommended in our plans? So with this one, again, there's a little bit of a repeat and a kind of a bringing together of our other criteria of how does the adopted plans really match up with these specific statements in our code about what this district should be used for. And that's, we find consistency where we see a good match happening between those two pieces. Lastly, I wanted to note, again, we also have what we call planned unit development, and these are custom zoning. So a site that is not going to zone into a standard district, but is going to kind of create specific regulations that address kind of unique circumstances on that site, and we result in a custom zoning district. We have additional criteria. So you have to meet the 5 criteria that I just outlined, and then these additional 3 criteria for a planned unit development. And that's, again, because we have a pretty high bar for doing custom zoning. Our planning documents speak to that we really should only use those in unique and extraordinary circumstances, or where we don't have a district that would address those. Sorry, I'll get to the question after, but where we don't have a district that really fits our plan guidance is really where we recommend those and where we see them suggested. So there's criteria here. One, we have standards for what should be included in a PUD. And so it has to be consistent with that and with the purpose, like I spoke to, of it being unique and extraordinary, is one criteria that must be found. Another is that it's not feasible under a standard zone district, or it would result in a number of waivers. That's another way to customize, is just change one part of our zoning standards. So if it's not feasible under standard zone district, that's a reason to consider something custom. And then the last one is ensuring that it's compatible so that it fits in with what's around it in terms of land uses and building forms. But so when you see what something come forward with a custom, it will have, a number of additional criteria that we're looking at to find that consistent.
And Liz, can you talk a little bit more about PUDs and if there's a minimum standard size, that sort of thing?
There is not a minimum standard size for that. So that's it can be proposed on a variety of different sites. It's really this high threshold of this additional criteria and meeting our plan guidance that again says that we should first look to find that standard zone district and then have a good rationale for why this site, often there's something unique about the site or how it transitions to the property around it that justifies doing something custom. Or maybe there's particular plan recommendations for that site that speak to a need to customize some of our standards.
And Monica, did that answer your question, or is there? Yeah, okay, great.
Okay, I think that was mine. And of course, we're happy to answer questions. Again, I know this is a wonky topic, so but we're hoping that going into a scenario will help us talk about this.
Let's just pause there for a second and see if there are any questions from folks. Yeah, Flor, and then Steve.
So my question is, in my area, a lot of the neighborhood plans are outdated or they're pretty much irrelevant at this point. So where does that fall into the criteria? Can we say like, well, we don't have a plan. How do we get a plan?
That's a great question. So that first criteria, the consistency with adopted plans, to the extent a neighborhood plan, even if it's 40 years old right now, and it's still adopted. So if it went to city council, we would still look to that plan to see what the recommendations were. We do sometimes then wind up in a difficult or not as straightforward situation where maybe our recent citywide plan has recommendations that are different or not perfectly aligned. And it is that kind of overall balance of how does it meet our plans overall. There is a plan to give every neighborhood a neighborhood plan. That's our neighborhood planning initiative, because we recognize that some places have very up-to-date guidance and some places don't. So that the goal is to give within, I don't know what time we're at currently, but originally it was like 10 to 15 years that we'd give everyone a neighborhood plan with updated guidance. And that would kind of supersede those older neighborhood plans where they exist.
Steve and then Lou.
I got a couple of quick questions, I hope. One is I got the impression that some of these criteria are in the charter, and by implication, some are not, some are in the code. And I wondered which are which, and is that an obstacle to changing some of them? Because it's harder to change the charter. Are we looking at potential charter changes, or are we going to steer clear of them, or just want some clarity on that? And then secondly, when rezonings are denied, which criteria have been most commonly the ones to have sunk a rezoning?
Okay, let's do the charter first, and then we'll do the rezonings and why, and then after Lou, we'll go to Alfonso.
So I would say on the charter, we have the uniformity of district regulations, one that I mentioned, and then I believe it's public health, safety, and welfare is kind of our overall like work of the city. So we are not expecting changing our charter takes a vote of the people. So we're not expecting to change the charter through this process or suggest changes to that. Certainly we could consider whether we need those additionally within our zoning criteria, but they are still there. They sort of still exist in something that needs to be considered as the city does its work piece, but we're expecting to address what's within our zoning code in this project. Did I answer all that?
And then what is the most common reason that rezonings are denied?
So, and others can chime in here with examples. I think often we don't have very many denials. I will say that it's not that common that something goes all the way to city council. But some places where they are found and are sometimes under that public health, safety, and welfare. So sort of different interpretations of how we read that that criteria. There might be things about something in that neighborhood that are being considered. Sometimes it's consistency with adopted plans, so the different thoughts on what the plan said, or there's different plans and how we interpret that piece that sometimes is a reason that council members find or vote that they don't feel that all the criteria have been met.
So we're going to go to Lou, Alfonso, and Caitlin, and then go to the scenarios. So Lou?
Yeah, so my question really relates to the review criteria where the property has old code zoning. So old code zoning, which may refer to, chapter 59, but there's also where we've had so many changes in areas where there's a new zone category, but there are old PUDs, or where some properties didn't opt into the new zoning categories. We have some of those in the Cherry Creek North Zone District. And so I just wanted to clarify that when property has old code zoning, we have a lot of those. I know in Cherry Creek East, everything was a PUD at one point in time. City wanted to get rid of those. So bringing that into a GRH3, for example, it's not Chapter 59, it's just an old PUD, and they're trying to get everything consistent in the neighborhood. So could you clarify when we talk about old code zoning, how extensive that is interpreted?
Yeah, I can try to take that one. Sorry. So that's a really good question. I think, when you see PUDs, essentially how we view those is if they were written at the time that we had former Chapter 59, then that would be former Chapter 59 zoning. So it's not until after 2010 when we were under the Denver zoning code. And then if you see PUDs after 2010, then those would be considered part of the Denver zoning code. Does that answer your question?
I think so. I'm just thinking of areas, for example, within Cherry Creek East, where it's an old PUD from prior to 2010, and they just want to go into the current zoning. So it would seem to me that that would be a fairly easy yes, even though, if that scenario is what you're thinking about, then yes, it would seem to me that would apply.
And you would also need to remember that the rezoning needs to meet all 5 of the review criteria. So in the Cherry Creek East example, I think, there is a recently adopted neighborhood plan that probably speaks to the appropriateness of zone districts like GRH3, which a lot of it has been rezoned to. So just aside from it being in the old zoning code and moving into the new code, it still needs to meet the other 4 criteria.
Okay, Alfonso. And then Caitlin. Alfonso, you're still on mute. There you go.
Yeah, sorry, I'm on my phone and kept turning off my screen, the sensor. Sorry. I just had a question. I think it's the 3rd criteria, the general health one. Public health, safety, and general welfare, sorry. I guess I feel like that one's like super ambiguous. I've seen rezonings come before council, and that's one of the ones where I'd like a little bit more clarification and understanding on how exactly they're actually being weighed and what can actually meet that criteria or shouldn't be meeting that criteria. And I say that, I guess, because, and obviously this might be more of my opinion than anything, but that seems to be, of the rezonings that I've been a witness of in council, it seems to often be one that is almost like a loophole and is very much left to interpretation sometimes based on the council member. And so then that just kind of like loses sometimes, again, in my opinion, its intent and purpose. So could you just clarify on or give some examples of like some concrete things that would meet that definition, just to get a better idea of like what it's actually supposed to mean, like what it's actually supposed to be doing.
Sure, I could jump in there, and I think you're highlighting, I think, what we've heard a lot so far. So consistent of that one is confusing and vague, and sometimes feels left up for interpretation, as you said. I'd say from a staff perspective, when we look at that, as I mentioned, that first criteria, adopted plans. During that adopted plan process, we would have also looked at whether, what is in the best interest of this neighborhood, what is the vision we've done, there's been community engagement around it, and what is the kind of the future for this area. And so we look at, and that's probably where sometimes it feels like very repetitive of like, we'd say, well, because it's implementing the adopted plan, it is also furthering public health, safety and welfare. And also speaking to some of those maybe improvements that come. So say for an example that if we use that light rail example, like maybe there's an industrial property, the area plan and our citywide plans have said we should have more housing and job opportunities in that area. And now a rezoning is proposed that would change from that industrial zoning to one that would allow that kind of mix of uses. When we get to that criteria, we'd be looking at, say, like that change furthers our public health, safety, and welfare by implementing this vision that we have for the neighborhood to provide more of those other uses. And then speak to kind of the improvements that could be made to the property under the standards. Like now there would be stronger standards around walkability, better buildings that could be built there. That type of thing is typically from like the staff perspective, how we would talk about that piece. We wouldn't be talking about a specific project. Remember that rezoning is looking at the district. So it's how does that district further it, and not whether a particular project and would make any improvements. Sometimes that's where we hear some of the comments about maybe traffic related to a particular project or like the specifics of one. That
So
helps
Liz,
with an
I
example.
think we've got a little confusion happening
Yep.
here around which part of that is in the criteria and which part is in the charter. So where do we have ability to add clarity and change things? And where does it have to go in the charter? So there's, I'm going to ask again that we try to keep it in the group rather than going off to the side and chat, since this is all related to each other, folks. Because we've got some questions happening about this in the chat and some confusion happening about what's in the charter, what can we change and not change.
Thank you for that. And I don't want us to feel too constrained in this conversation about that. I think we wanted to give you that perspective of like, as we look at the suggestions, we'll be looking at what's possible or not from like that kind of that charter perspective, but I don't want to constrain us too much there about that piece. And I think from a kind of preliminary thought, there is already by being consistent with our adopted plans and that first criteria, there's certainly already that piece about furthering our public health, safety, and welfare. So I think there's ability to clarify, there's ability to kind of make some changes there to make this like a little less confusing or that piece. So at least for this conversation, I'd hope that we don't get too caught up in the exact changes we can make where, and speak to what we would like to see as people meet this criteria or other criteria that we should consider.
Okay, so it's great. We're also starting to get into some recommendations already, both on the area plans and thinking about this health, safety, and welfare. I'm going to ask you that if your question is your comment is to go deeper on recommendations, you hold those for just a bit. Otherwise, we've got Caitlin and Lindsay. I see your hand and you've been trying to get it in chat too. So I'm going to let both of you go before we go to scenarios. So Caitlin and then Lindsay.
Yeah, I'll start with a comment and then follow with a request. The comment just on the public health, safety, welfare, just to give a little color, and I'm sure the city attorneys would jump in and say something similar, is that terminology is what the police power and like the power to regulate land use comes from. And so that's where that language comes from. So you'll see it repeated. Now, I'm not saying it isn't worth our discussion, but just as a background, that's why that language is there. And then second, as a request, I would just ask from staff's perspective, before we dive into our discussions or potential recommendations, I would love to hear from CPD staff about their thoughts on these criteria, because they have to craft staff recommendations and staff reports on every single one of these, and sort of which ones did they struggle with, or which ones did they think, could maybe deserve some clarity that people seem to struggle with. Thanks.
Thank you for that, Caitlin. I appreciate you reframing that piece of that. That's kind of our general, as you said, police power, but the ability of like government in general that we should always be like that's setting the stage of furthering public health, safety, and welfare is a standard that you'll see for every city government and as we establish zoning laws. And we're happy to, and we will be kind of providing kind of like evaluation. We wanted to hear some of the feedback from the task force here. I think I spoke to a little bit there of some of that. We agree that we know that one in particular, public health, safety, and welfare, leads to some confusion as we not confusion on the staff side, I guess, but a confusion of like what it means for the public and feels like we're repeating what we're doing in the first criteria of consistency with adopted plans. And similarly with the fifth one, I think sometimes too, which is about like, again, looking at the zone district and how it matches up with the plan. So there is some redundancy that happens and sometimes, and just lack of clarity about what those terms mean as we present them and talk with the community about them.
Great, Lindsay. And then Alfonso, I'm not certain if your hand is raised from before, if you have another question. So Lindsay.
And thanks, whoever just spoke clarified this a little bit more about where that language comes from. But I guess I want to call attention to that safety and welfare and those things are really loaded and can, if we're talking about equity, we really need to keep in mind, the question safety for whom, welfare for whom, like what exactly does that mean and whose safety and welfare is it serving? And just so that's a comment, and then we don't have to berate this, but I'm curious if there are any objective measures that are used to evaluate safety and welfare and stuff besides the plan. Like, is there anything when the planning board or city council is reviewing a rezoning, do they have things that they can kind of objectively say, is this affecting safety? Is this affecting welfare? In what way? Or is it just going back to the plans and people's opinions, essentially? Does that question make sense? Let me know if it doesn't.
Yeah, I'm trying to think through that. It does make sense. Right now, we do not have I would say, like, I guess what you're saying, like kind of like data or metrics that we would be looking at related to that. Again, it's this kind of deference to that. We've gone through a planning process where we've considered those and we've put a vision together with the community and made recommendations, and we're looking to that plan, and it's more of a qualitative assessment that goes into the staff recommendation now.
Okay, thanks. Then I would repeat that. I think that's a really important one to think about when it comes to equity, and that there's could be major.
Yeah, thanks, Lindsay. That's been a theme throughout about what does this mean for public meetings? What does it mean in the criteria? And as we look next month too at equitable outcomes and what are we thinking about there, I'm sure it's going to keep coming up, and it's good to keep flagging it. So thank you for the great questions, as well as the start of some recommendations. Brandon, take us through the scenarios so we can continue to go deeper on this.
Sure, I think I will be reading
Sorry, Robbie.
Scenarios. No, not a problem. So yeah, but before we jump into the actual scenario that we're going to take a look at, just kind of want to frame this with some questions. So as we're talking about this, and as you're listening and reading this this scenario, think about which of the criteria is hardest to digest or understand, and think about what you might change about those criteria in order to help advance equity and to address some of the identified issues that we've talked about earlier in this project.
So folks, we are certainly hearing the questions about safety, and Lindsay just raised a really good question, and be thinking in the back of your minds, are there quantifiable measures that could potentially be proposed as we think about that? So great, Rob, take us through a scenario.
All right. So before I read through the scenario here, just take a look at the image on the right. The proposed rezoning, the location of this rezoning that we're going to talk about is, think about it just under the letters of this proposed rezoning in this image on the right. And then you'll hear about this light rail station, and that's nearby, just a few blocks away under those letters as well, near the railroad tracks there. So Development 1 has purchased a building near a newly built light rail station. Currently, a small neighborhood serving nonprofit organization rents the space in the existing one-story building. The site is within a Nest neighborhood, and the area is considered to be vulnerable for displacement according to Blueprint Denver's equity concepts. Development 1 proposes to rezone from a 2-story to an 8-story zone district in order to redevelop the property with retail and residential uses. This proposed zone district would be CMX8. The site has been zoned its current zone district for 2 stories since 2010. The area is part of a recent neighborhood plan that was adopted in 2020 and included 1.5 years of community engagement. The plan recommended more walkable housing, neighborhood serving retail, and job opportunities near the station with heights up to 8 stories. Similar guidance is recommended in Blueprint Denver. The applicant engaged with local organizations and the existing tenant during the application process, and this resulted in a neighborhood agreement about the building design, as well as an agreement to lease the space to an existing nonprofit in the new building. So taking a look at the criteria and how it relates to this. So during the staff recommendation, this might be the kind of summarizes the recommendation that might be put forward. So the CMX8 zone district supports the plan guidance by increasing the pedestrian-friendly mixed use in this area. It furthers equity goals in the adopted plan by providing opportunities for more housing and the neighborhood serving use that's also nearby transit. The second criteria, uniformity with district regulations. So this CMX8 zone district didn't have any waivers or conditions and therefore would be the same as a CMX8 zone district anywhere else in the city. So far, those first 2 criteria appear to be met. The third criterion, furthering public health, safety, and welfare. So the application supports the city adopted plans, which provide opportunity for more walkable mixed use development through transit and also through the implementation and consistency with adopted plans is found to further public health, safety, and welfare. The fourth criterion, justifying circumstance. There are changing conditions, including the newly adopted plan that we talked about that was adopted after 1.5 years of community engagement. And additionally, the new light rail station that was put in is a changing condition and new infrastructure in the area. So there are justifying circumstances found. And the last criterion, consistency with neighborhood context, zone district purpose, and intent statements. So this urban center neighborhood context in the CMX8 zone district, and as well as the purpose and intent statements for the mixed use zone districts and the intent statement specific to the CMX8 zone district are all consistent with the adopted plans recommendations for this area and this zone district. So there is consistency and alignment between the plan guidance and this zone district's statements. So all of these criterion found to be met in staff's recommendation. So at the City Council public hearing, there are 9 community members signed up to speak in opposition of the rezoning, citing concerns related to the inadequate existing infrastructure and potential displacement in the neighborhood. However, the speakers do not clearly articulate which review criteria are not being met. And after the public hearing is closed, City Council discusses the application, and some agree with the concerns raised by speakers. During the vote, some council members vote to deny the application based on it not meeting the first and third criteria, these being consistency with adopted plans and the furthering of public health, safety, and welfare. So with that criterion in mind, or sorry, with that scenario in mind, I'm going to tee up some more discussion around these criteria. And we can also bounce back to any of the previous slides too, if anyone would like to take a look at those again.
So Rob, thanks for showing us again the criteria being the consistency with the adopted plan, uniformity, that nebulous one of health, safety, and welfare, justifying circumstances, and neighborhood context, zone district, intent, and statements. So Robert or Andrew, would you mind just putting those in chat for those people who can see chat so they can be reminded of them? And then let's take down the screens and have some good discussion about this. So Bruce, we're going to start with you.
Thanks, Rox. I'm curious and will, I guess, introduce a topic here about why and why you put it in and why it's relevant that an agreement was reached between the applicant and the neighbors, because that has nothing to do with the criteria. And it's my understanding that it should not be applicable in council's review or the city's review of a rezoning request. And so why is it introduced in this hypothetical example? Thank you.
So Liz, other than we had it last time too, talk to us about it. And so for those of you who are recognizing the scenario, yes, this is the same one the scenarios we used last time. So Liz.
Yeah, thanks for bringing that up, Bruce. I think we wanted to stick to like some of the ideas that and fact pattern that came up from the last scenario, and that being something that does sometimes happen concurrent with the rezoning. But Bruce is absolutely right that if it's not an agreement with the city, we don't kind of consider, and you'll see that in the kind of criteria piece, that as a kind of factor in why we should approve or not approve for rezoning. That's a kind of private agreement that's happened. There's actually not a guarantee with the city not being the one enforcing it, that agreement stays in place. But we wanted to put that in there as something that's happening, and some of these issues that we've heard come up, like maybe there's thoughts about that piece of the process and how that should factor into the criteria or not, and just wanted to have that in there as a part that sometimes is happening at the same time as a rezoning, and to carry over some of what we talked about at the last meeting.
Maggie and then Steve. Oh, I'm sorry, and Joel.
Joel was up before me.
Thanks, Maggie. So Joel, Maggie, Steve, and then Alfonso.
Hi, everyone. This kind of illustrates what I like about our community involved planning, where rather than simply being reactive, someone proposes something and then everybody has to react to it. In this scenario, the community has a neighborhood plan. So they got together, took a year and a half, came up with their consensus vision for the future. I want that for every neighborhood. I know what a different world it is to live in when your whole community has been involved in envisioning the future together, because then when change does happen, essentially evaluating or change is proposed, it's simply evaluating, is this in line with what we all agreed on or not? And while that's criteria one, I think it's pervasive throughout all the criteria. So in this scenario, the applicant did the right thing, working with the community, and they agreed, yes, this is consistent with our neighborhood plan. And staff's analysis, at least as far as we're given the information here, looks all correct. It's uniformity of district regulations and justifying circumstances because there's a new area plan, et cetera, is pretty straightforward. But the key of it is they're proposing to do what the community called for. I can imagine a different system where it is more reactive, and you're instead of asking, is this doing what we in the community envisioned and documented and have consensus on in a plan, we were instead asking the question, is this compatible with what's already there? And then you just end up having a fight against any change. Instead, we have a system that directs change where we want it and doesn't direct change where we don't want it. And that's memorialized in these plans, making this exercise, relatively straightforward and saying, is this doing what our plans called for? Now, as for the not all that rare scenario where outside of the community meetings, some other people happen to show up at the final public hearing and say, we have some anxiety. People will have anxiety. I don't see a lot here that makes me question that it meets the criteria, nor do I see a lot here that makes me question whether we have the right criteria in the final paragraph that talks about 9 people showed up and they had some concerns. I've been in the position to not only evaluate the criteria for many years on planning board, but also to hear people's concerns. And if people don't want something to happen, they will quite often say, we don't have the infrastructure, right? Like quite recently, there was a proposed rezoning in a wealthy part of town to allow an ADU. And we had several letters that said, oh my God, we don't have the infrastructure. The streets are just going to the sewer lines, you won't believe. And so you listen to that sort of thing and you ask yourself, are they speaking to the criteria? And quite often not. And frankly, quite often you're able to hear behind what they're saying, concern about loss of segregation and some other really unfortunate motivations. But this scenario doesn't, to me, speak to not meeting the criteria, nor to calling for different criteria. But I'm interested in what others think.
Okay, thanks, Joel, for your recommendations on area plans and the importance, and as we heard before, and keeping them current. So we're going to go to Maggie, Steve, Alfonso, Flor, Lindsay.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I feel like what's coming up for me, and it just came in so clearly, I think with the conversation so far is, yes, we are talking about criteria around plans that were memorialized and are quite frankly dated as it relates to some area plans, which was already stated on this call. And what's really coming up for me is that it is so hard to be beholden and to put this criteria in place, which is, this criteria is beholden to other processes that created these agreements that may feel like community was involved, but quite frankly, and I know I speak for others in this, they're not, those processes were not equitable, and they did not actually reflect the true vision of the community. And in fact, the community oftentimes doesn't even really understand the process, and they don't really even have a seat at the table. And so I think what, yes, what just kind of is glaringly obvious for me is, where is true community authentic engagement in this criteria? And how do we address the current needs? Life is changing very quickly. And if we're beholden to plans that weren't even equitable, didn't even stand on equitable processes to begin with, and they're dated the moment they're essentially signed, can we be more nimble? Does this task force, does this process have the ability to step outside of what we think we need just to be efficient and effective, quote unquote? So I don't know. I think I'm really having a hard time with not really seeing community centered in any of this criteria.
Great. So I'm really hearing a recommendation about these community plans, that timeliness of them, but as Maggie's saying, they may be outdated from the start, that how equitable they are from the start, that we have a flaw underlying the criteria in the plans, and how current they are, how equitable the process was. That sort of thing is a recommendation. Okay, moving on to Steve.
I'm going to try to be concise, but I was inspired by the first question about this community agreement, because in part because I've actually negotiated with Bruce on such agreements, and I know some of how they can work. And it occurred to me that sometimes that agreement is used as a token of equity. And there's all kinds of problems with it. One is who actually was involved with the agreement. In the case I'm thinking of with Bruce, we had a pretty good process. A lot of people impacted were actually engaged and so forth, and I'm happy with the result. But on the whole, it still seems to fall back on the deficiencies of the, on the one hand, the RNO system in Denver, which I think a lot of what we're talking about could be, our recommendations should maybe impact we talk about the RNO system in the end. We should talk about how they participate in rezonings. And then also the whole idea of if you get some kind of an agreement that is on the side, it's a totally private agreement, but the way that it's tokenized is as now the neighborhood association of whatever sort will support the rezoning, and that's carried forward to city council as a piece of evidence that somehow the city council has to fit that into the criteria somehow. And it seems like a weak fit to me that support of an RNO doesn't, maybe the RNO is crafty the way the attorneys who help people with big rezonings are, and they use all the language in the criteria very carefully to make it sound like the RNO's agreement is a way to get this rezoning to fit the criteria. But on the whole, I think there's a weak link in these side agreements, using them as some idea of community support, when there are also these other tools like recently adopted small area plans. So I think we need to dive into that at some point, and I think it's almost the crux for me.
Great, thanks, Steve. So recommendation about community engagement and agreements could have a role, but we have to look carefully at who's involved, how they're involved in the role of the RNOs in that. And I do see additional hands. So we are going to Alfonso, Flor, and Lindsay next, and then we'll get to Lou and Monica. Alfonso?
Yeah, thank you. I guess my question is a part comment, part question is, I guess, when we're talking about those equity goals that are outlined specifically now in Blueprint Denver, right, in your scenario, this was kind of like at the start of the forefront of the scenario, which is, right, that this is in a nest neighborhood, vulnerable to displacement. But then when you move on to the criteria, those equity goals get lost in translation, or they can be outright dismissed because they don't formulate essentially in a concrete way as a part of that of the actual criteria, right? And this is where I mean, like, where I could argue, for example, in that scenario, that an 8-story market rate development that's backed up by tons of evidence ignites pressures for displacement. That goes against the general welfare of that neighborhood, right? And every time that gets brought up, well, then, because it's so open to interpretation, especially on that front of the general welfare, that those equity goals never get reached, and they become more just acknowledgements more than anything. So how can we actually get these equity goals ingrained into the actual criteria without allowing it to get lost in translation, without allowing it to become subjective, whether it's to a single individual person that comes up and shows up for public comment, or if it's subjective specifically to a politician, which is a council person in that seat who's going to vote on that criteria, right? So it's part comment, part question. I'd like to understand more, especially from CPD's perspective, how they actually balance that when they're reviewing that as a criteria, especially in nest neighborhoods. How do you ensure that your recommendation for approval to move on in the process isn't actually going against those equity goals?
So Alfonso, I think you came on maybe a bit after I had said that we are going to spend our entire time on the 14th of September going into some of those equitable goals. So let's see if CPD can answer now, but also everybody flag that that is our next conversation to go deep there, which is absolutely where we have to go. Liz? Is that you or Brandon?
I'm happy to jump in, and I think you're raising a big issue that we do want to spend more time on. What we do now is capture that equity piece under consistency with adopted plans. And you're right that that's a very broad topic, but that those goals are there. So even if they're not in an outdated neighborhood plan, they are there in our citywide plans, and that's where we are evaluating that. And we've been working on this, what we're calling the equity analysis, but it's something that we've put in to dive deeper in nest neighborhoods and in larger neighborhoods, where we look more at those factors. What are the specific data driving some of those equity pieces, and talking with the applicant about that and things that they can do, and with the neighborhood about that. So there's some things we've been doing that are not in specifically in changing our criteria, right? That's in our zoning code, and that takes a process like this, but ways that we've been really trying to elevate that in our evaluation of that consistency with adopted plans piece.
Floor?
Thank you. I just wanted to ask you really quick, Rox, going back to what the question was, it was about this specific criteria, going back to what we are actually talking about, because I also got caught up in that and feel a little confused now.
Yeah, the topic today is really about the criteria and what else needs to be done on the criteria and recommendations we have for how the criteria is used, what's included in the criteria. And I'm just going to remind people that not everyone can see chat. So if you could please keep coming back to the group in the spirit of equity and inclusion, that would be awesome. We don't want to be having a group about equity and inclusion and excluding people from the start. So just asking you all to keep bringing that back. So Flor, did I answer your question?
I believe so, but now I'm confused how what Alfonso said didn't fit that, because he's saying like, what can we add? How can we include equity in that?
No, I didn't mean to dismiss his comment at all. All I was saying is our next meeting, we're going to go deep into what is the equity overlay that the city is currently using.
Okay. Well, one thing that just came up for me, and I don't know if this should be part of that conversation or this conversation at this point, but the thing that stood out to me is like, if there's a development going in next to my house or up the street, and I want to say something about it, and I have feelings about it, but I don't know how to, tie it to one of these criterias. And quite frankly, I'm pretty sure many people don't even know that their opinion only matters when it comes to these criteria, and may not state their concern in the right way where it's framed to match with the criteria. And are they educated in what the criteria is in itself? So to me, all of this is just kind of like very complicated. And if I'm going to go tell you how I feel, that's not going to do anything for me. I have to tell you how it fits into this criteria, and how are people going to know that and put that into words and tie it to the criteria that it pertains to.
Yeah, good points. Very hard for people to know how and where to connect in. Okay, next is Lindsay, Lou, Monica, and then Bruce.
I just wanted to reemphasize everything that Maggie said in the beginning, especially the community engagement piece, that it's concerning that there's not really in the criteria, there's nothing really about community engagement. I understand that the plans are supposed to have been completed through thorough community engagement, but as we've heard from multiple people on the task force, the process for the plans weren't always equitable to begin with. So I urge everyone to not assume that they were, and listen to the folks who are speaking from experience that they were not.
And along that line, earlier, I think it was Steve who mentioned community agreements. Do you think that's one of the ways that we could do it, or do you think there needs to be some different tools to doing that?
What did he mean by community agreements?
Steve, you want to answer that?
Well, I've only done one of them in the context of rezoning, so I don't know that I know the whole sphere, but we had a rezoning of a single property that would have allowed a lot of uses, and we worked closely with all the neighbors and the community and the neighborhood at large to craft an agreement privately to, if the rezoning were to be passed by city council, that that some of those uses would be restricted by would become deed restrictions, that not something that the city necessarily would enforce, but there would be restrictions on the deed. And it's a little complicated to describe, but it basically made the neighbors feel that the uses that they were most concerned that they might get with this rezoning, not the ones that the property owner said that they wanted to do, but ones that could potentially happen in the future if the property, changed hands or the property owner changed their mind. Those uses were in the minds of the community under control as a result of this agreement. And so then there's the whole way that agreement becomes a piece of the city process by the community because of the agreement, or the RNO in this case, because of the agreement, formally supporting the rezoning in return for what they got in the private agreement. And so city council, how does the city council look at that RNO support? Where exactly in the criteria does RNO support fit? And I think it can be wordsmithed, but I think that it's pretty vague. And there's nothing that specifically says in city council must consider whether an RNO supports it or not. They can use it as evidence for one of the criteria, maybe. I hope that's enough explanation because I'm going on too long.
Okay, if I just want to throw out there, if you're talking about community benefits agreement, sounds like you are. I guess I would urge people away from depending on those. I'm working on one in Sun Valley with the Stadium District, and it's just labor intensive, time intensive, and money intensive. So we definitely can't rely on community benefits agreement to achieve goals with every development, or equity goals with every development.
Great, thanks, Lindsay. Lou?
So I have had quite a bit of experience with development agreements, community benefit agreements, RNO agreements, whatever you want to call them, it doesn't matter. What matters is that, I think to Steve's point, is it allows the neighbors to actually have impact. When you talk about community engagement and you talk about a property that is adjacent to people who have lived there a long time or who have a real interest in this, whether or not they were concerned or at the table during the implementation or the adoption of the neighborhood plan, that does give people a voice, where especially where there are specific concerns on how the proposed development relates to their property. So I think we've talked about this before. All RNOs are not the same. All community plans are not the same. But I think to Joel's point, we have to have something where you can look at a neighborhood plan. It's on the website. It's available to anybody who wants to look at it. Are there issues with it? If so, then the community engagement should be open, whether it's at the RNO level, which is still right now the only ordinance supported way to gather information other than just individuals giving it. But it is still the way for a group of people to work together, generally on the plan and specifically on these development agreements in order to accomplish a goal. And I think specifically on, I agree with Alfonso that the kinds of issues like displacement, I mean, you don't find those specifically in the criteria, but in the example, it said this was a community subject to concerns for displacement. And the only thing that addressed that was the community benefit agreement, the development agreement that said the small nonprofit entity that might have been displaced by this development was by agreement going to be included as a tenant in the new building. So it was the sort of equitable concern about displacement was really addressed more by that development agreement than any other of the criteria. So it is a question, as Steve pointed out, how do those relate to the approval? But in this case, the one vulnerable nonprofit was actually benefited from being displaced in that process.
Thank you. Monica, Bruce, Joel, oops, I'm sorry, Monica, Bruce, Brendan, Joel.
I think the example for me demonstrates the subjectivity of the criteria. And I'm thinking back to something Lindsay said a little bit ago, like, are there metrics? I mean, that we can utilize in criteria to be evaluating projects. You know, everyone knows that there is inequity throughout the city in terms of RNOs and voice. And so I keep thinking, you know, are there citywide goals that can be identified such that each neighborhood, each council district, you know, is pulling their weight in terms of addressing a changing city? We know cities change. That example highlighting there is now a light rail. There's now a neighborhood plan. So there were changing circumstances, and yet because we don't have sort of citywide goals, we then can't evaluate the projects against anything other than subjective criteria. So I'm kind of thinking maybe that's the route we go, so that then things can get more defined, because I think we know that you know, defining equity is even challenging, right? Or defining engagement. So I think that would maybe help. I don't want to crunch the numbers to figure out the metrics. You guys do that.
That's very honest, Monica. Bruce, I'm sorry. Yeah, Bruce.
Thank you, Rox. I have two comments. One, with regard to all this discussion on agreements between a community and a developer. I brought this up because while it's not part of the criteria, there are often, it leads to really good outcomes and, you know, positive results. And one reason is that it can afford neighbors more predictable outcomes. In the rezoning isn't, you know, a blank check, so to speak. And I've done these on uses like Steve mentioned. I've done them on building heights, and I've done them where you know, neighbors wanted to make sure that the garages were in the alley and not on the street, and they wanted stoops and front doors and certain types of windows. In the zoning code is silent on all those things. And so it's a great example of good community engagement leading to better outcomes, I think. So anyway, just so everybody knows that, and I think that often they are used to incorporate and require equity concepts to be addressed in different rezoning scenarios. But I think the city needs to, and CPD should look into, you know, how to best use this tool, if at all, and can it be a part of the criteria and that type of thing. And then on this, in response to something Lindsay said about that they're long and arduous and expensive to undertake and so forth. I agree with that, but in my experience, the city won't touch them with a 10-foot pole. In you know, CPD refuses to get involved and engage with these. And so it can only be left to an applicant and the community to work on. And that history, that's the way it's been. And so maybe that's something that, again, is looked into through this committee. And then the other thing that I think people should be aware of in maybe some recommendations could come out of this task force. And so in this scenario, the equity concepts came up in this hypothetical scenario that we're discussing. And Blueprint Denver is explicit and unambiguous that small rezonings cannot be looked to address equity concepts. So here we are, presented with kind of another conundrum where in this hypothetical scenario it came up, but in potentially in conflict or not consistent with the policy direction we have in Blueprint. And so I think that's another thing that perhaps we should be discussing and thinking about here. Thank you.
Right. Yeah. And I think that goes with some of Alfonso's earlier comments about displacement and considering displacement as part of equity as well, and ensuring that as we think about all of that. So Brendan, and then Joel, and then Lindsay.
Thank you, and apologize for getting here late today. So apologize if I say something that's already been said, but just wanted to kind of echo what Alfonso's raising up in terms of taking the ambiguity out of things and making sure that we have a specific criteria that deals with equity and deals with the impact on displacement. I think I heard that right now equity is being measured by consistency with adopted plans. And all I can speak to is it's our experience in East Colfax, and the East Colfax Community Collective and the East Colfax Neighborhood Association. In our East area planning process, both mobilized significant participation in that process to raise up the concern that we didn't feel the plan was addressing displacement enough. And we had multiple meetings where we expressed that concern, we pushed for changes to the plan. And in the end, both of those organizations, the EC3 and ECNA, came out in opposition to the East Area Plan because we did not feel that it did enough to address the displacement concerns that we had in our neighborhood. And when it came to voting at City Council, the meetings that we organized to participate in that planning process were used to justify that the process was equitable, that there was diverse representation at the table, that we had rooms of 75 immigrant and refugee leaders in these meetings sharing their concerns. And that was what was used to say that the plan was an equitable process when the organizations that were a part of that opposed the plan. And so, how can we say that adopted area plan represents equity and should be the guiding post for future rezoning answers when the most significant organizations that do the work in community in that neighborhood oppose the plan? And so I just think we have to do better. We have to have specific measurements, metrics that can measure the impact on equity and measure the impact on displacement if we really want to achieve what this committee, I believe, has been tasked with.
Thanks, Brendan. You can continue to raise the questions about how old are the plans, how are they used, who is involved, are they still supported, all of those questions, because they may even be current, but still not have been inclusive in terms of who was involved. And just noting that in the chat, Lou referenced the RNO work from before as well. Last time we had two people at the meeting who are part of the RNO task force who said they haven't made any progress in terms of updating this yet. And so do we continue though to come back to these questions about RNOs, and do they have the resources? What all do they need? And just a reminder that there's a task force that's working on that, but they didn't have anything at all yet in terms of anything to come back and talk to us about. So just looping back into what's happening in chat, feel free to keep raising your hands on those things as well. So we are, Joel, and then Lindsay, and then Flor, and then I'm going to stop for a second. And some of you have been quieter today, and encourage you that if you have something to add, to please raise your hands too. But we'll give you a second to think about that. So Joel, Lindsay, and Flor.
Okay, thank you. I raised my hand initially just to bring up two small points that Rox didn't want to just leave in the chat. And then I have two larger points. The two small points were just hearing some of the folks talk about this particular scenario, made reference to an old plan that had been around and nobody knew. And in this particular scenario, it's a very recent plan that, spent 1.5 years on and then just completed in 2020. So that puts me in reacting to this scenario in the mindset that that the community was involved. I know that the city is getting better and better at digging deeper into the community to have involvement in area plans, and certainly not just depending on RNOs to get everybody to turn out. And then sort of immediately after that plan here in 2022, proposing a rezoning. So that influences the way I think about it. If it said they have an area plan, but nobody living remembers working on it, that would be a different feel to that. Also, in this, a colleague here mentioned that it would be all market rate, and that's essentially not possible in Denver anymore with the passage of EHA. Whether people think EHA went far enough or not, or it's good if people take the incentive, or because it really helps all affordable housing developers. I think there are citywide things that are happening that are helping. They're not solving, but they're helping that should be considered. And then stepping back to a broader level, I want to mention something that Bruce is also mentioning, because it connects to a recommendation I made earlier in this process. Blueprint Denver explicitly calls on the city to start looking at doing legislative rezonings following adopting new area plans. And Bruce pointed out the blueprint also calls for using the equity concepts like vulnerability to displacement and the other concerns in doing those larger rezonings. And I think that's a fantastic way if we could move to doing something like that, where the community could really talk about these concerns in implementing the vision. What else do we need to keep in mind, and not try to imagine that one individual building is going to cause a lot of problems, which is really hard to connect the dots on, but rather work together on saying, what are we ready to implement now? What tools do we need in place to address some of the concerns that are identified with data, so that we can implement the rest of it later? And I think that would just be a whole new level of hands-on community involvement, going the next level away from being reactive to individual rezoning proposals. Thanks.
If I could dive in and real quick and react to what Joel just said. Sorry, folks. Joel, you mentioned the concept of one building causing problems, but the flip side is also true. One building solving problems is very challenging.
Yeah. I mean, it puts people in a whole mind game of what if, that there's no data to point to, and then it's just competing optimism versus anxiety. So it's a very hard way to go about things.
Lindsay, and then Flor.
This might be a question for CPD staff, but I want to clarify, or Bruce, what you meant when you said this, or what you said is, I thought I heard that in Blueprint Denver, equity considerations aren't supposed to be taken into consideration in individuals' rezonings. Is that what I heard? If that's the case, then this whole task force is like against that. So I guess I'm a little confused.
Liz?
I clarify. So I think what Bruce was speaking to is that Blueprint acknowledges the difficulty of applying the kind of the data, which is at an aggregate level with those equity measures, to a small rezoning, that it's like more effective to look at like a larger recommendation or that piece, that it would be difficult to kind of apply that at a very small scale. But there's other recommendations in Blueprint Denver that say we should be integrating equity into our rezoning process. That's like one of the driving recommendations for this task force. So there's that language is specific about kind of that those equity data metrics and the challenge of trying to apply those at a very small scale.
Okay, thanks.
Great, helpful. Floor.
I just wanted to bring up one more thing when it comes back to the neighborhood plans not being done in a lot of the area. And also state that the fact that there's not one done and there was like, oh, in 10 or 15 years, like it's gonna be done. 10 or 15 years means displacement has happened. Displacement has already happened. Displacement is happening every day. So I just want that to be said when we're talking about when are these neighborhood plans going to be done.
So the negative impacts of not getting these done, we really need to be highlighting in this.
Lindsay, is your hand still up from previously, or?
I'll take it down.
Okay, Caitlin and Brittany, and then we unfortunately are going to have to go to public comment. Not unfortunately, we may have great public comment as well, but just in terms of our time limit. So sorry, Ben, I know you're here and I don't know if you have public comment or not. I didn't mean that negative about anything you might say. Caitlin and then Brittany.
Thanks. So I know we were working within the context of the scenario, but I think as we look at these criteria and talk about the different concepts and what could maybe use some massaging or revision, I think the other thing that we've talked about as a group before is also sort of removing barriers to rezoning, because it's not just always a new development. I mean, often it's an ADU, or I have a client right now, and yes, he had to involve a land use attorney because he's just trying to expand a building and or expand his existing office in a neighborhood, and it's an old PUD, and it's complex enough that he had to have an attorney help him achieve a rezoning. And so I think that there's also the flip, right, of we don't want to place more barriers for people to do rezonings to achieve results that we want in our city.
Thanks. Brittany?
Thanks. Sorry, I have COVID, so I'm not gonna come on camera, so do excuse me. I just want to, a lot of folks have touched on it already. I think all communities have community leaders, and being able to identify those community leaders and bringing them into this process, they will know who in the community to tap into. I just think it's really important to identify those. The city is really good at identifying folks for like proposals and different grants that are available. I would like to see the same thing happening to different community organizations, leaders, and how we can tap into that lived experience and knowledge. In the city, I keep hearing a lot about a future that the city council has been asking about how to track displacement, because yes, someone already mentioned that displacement currently happens. My job, I rehouse people. So every day, all day, there are people who are being displaced in our neighborhoods of Denver due to property sold, new buildings going up, landlords increasing rent. And these are quote unquote quality renters who, and then we cannot, like, they can afford quote unquote rent, but they can't afford the new rents in those neighborhoods. So how do we track that? And when we're sending out information about rezoning, I would instantly like to see the displacement, and if it's a residential building going up, I would like to see what are the plans in place to relocate those businesses and families to extent back into those communities, and putting it on the city and the developer to, do that rehousing so we don't have such a mass exit to that neighborhood and the identities are completely lost. We do know that information up front when we're putting up buildings. What is the displacement rate? So I would like to see total transparency with that. And then, yeah, just once again, just tracking that information when we're putting up new buildings and rezoning, what is that data? And truly being able to have that in real point in time and not 5-10 years down the road, because Denver is rapidly changing and I would say has already changed quite a bit. And yeah, I would just, July 1st, there was a big mass exit of Denver of a lot of working class families and individuals because a lot of different laws and stuff changed in the rental world for us. So I just want to we got to be able to track this and put a data point to that face.
Councilwoman Sandoval, and then Joel, I think you have something that was well building on this in chat that I want to bring back to the group again.
Thank you. So I just want to thank everyone for this conversation, because as someone who votes on these 5 criteria, it's super challenging because I could take the welfare and safety, I could look that into a whole different category. So I'm so glad to have this conversation. And the first criteria, adopted plans, half of my neighborhood doesn't even have adopted plans, and gentrification has rapidly happened. And so we have to look to Blueprint Denver, a huge document that outlines everything in Denver, and look for that for guidance, which is not always helpful and which isn't always correct. And then leaning in on registered neighborhood organizations to do the work, it just doesn't feel accurate. It doesn't feel fair. We don't give them any resources. We don't give them any training. We don't give them anything at all to be able to say, hey, what kind of letter of support have you worked on, or what are you doing? So just want to say that this for me as your land use commissioner, because we're city council, we vote on contracts and changes. And then we also are land use commissioners, which are very rare. I sat in with Ramstein Height and Farber, and I was the only city council member and land use commissioner on that panel. And so we have double duty. And when it comes to these 5 criteria and where did they stem from, and I believe a lot of our zoning code was built in racist times. We didn't have a zoning code. My house was built in 1943 and we didn't have a zoning code. Most of my neighborhoods in Northwest Denver were built before we have a zoning code. And so we implemented a zoning code and we have major unintended consequences. So just want to thank this committee for the work on honing in on these 5 criteria, because if I don't follow these 5 criteria, we put the city liable at being held for a lawsuit, and that happens. And so I take that very serious, and I know our planning board members take that very serious. They could be held liable. And so revising these 5 criteria to make sure that they're in line with the equity goals in Blueprint Denver was why I kept advocating to update these 5 criteria and this equity in rezoning, because as somebody who sits on the dais every Monday night, half of our city council meetings go to land use, and we're basing these 5 criteria on something that's super antiquated. So thank you for the robust discussion, because as somebody who takes this, not saying that my colleagues don't, but land use is something that Northwest Denver has experienced such rapid displacement. What are we doing to make sure that we are including people back into the conversation and bringing people back into Denver?
Thank you, Councilwoman. And just noting in chat that Joel had made a recommendation that the affordable housing portion should have a local preference for people who already live in the area. And then Bruce added to it that is included in some of the agreements that he's done, which we know are not part of the process and the criteria that we've suggested. And so I'm just summarizing there because we do have to go to public comment at this point. Sorry about that. And yes, Councilwoman Sandoval, that was presented to committee last week. I hate to do this. If we don't have public comment, I'll come back, Joel, but got to go to public comment. So looking to Ben, is there any public comment from you, Ben? I believe Craig already left the meeting. Okay, hearing none. Joel, go ahead. And Claudia came off of mute, so I also want Claudia to have a chance to speak.
Yeah, thanks. Thank you for summarizing what I wrote. The only part that I wanted to be sure was in there was whether or not a rezoning happens, the affordable portion should have local preference, in my opinion. And this goes back to when this task force kicked off, CPD gave us some great reading material. And it said that some huge portion, 90+% of all development that happens is not immediately preceded by a rezoning, which is great in terms of it doesn't have 9 months of a risky process to know what they can do. They already have their rezoning, but they already have their zoning. But it's really important that in EHA, they're required to build affordable housing if they're doing residential. It's not something we're only placing at the feet of the people who go through rezoning. And I'm just recommending going one step further in the affordable housing that's produced to have local preference. Thanks.
Okay, thank you so much. Claudia.
Thank you, Rox. This is always so interesting. And one of the things when you think about equity, and I know this is like really redundant, but there's somebody that can stand and look over the fence, no problem. And then somebody can stand on their tippy toes and look, and somebody needs a platform for the wheelchair. And so it's not just, it's very different equity than equality. and areas that, have not had an update to their zoning, or, speaking to what Councilwoman Sandoval was talking about, there are historical inequities, and some of which have been baked into the charter. And while that isn't part of our task, I think it is important to go back and look at that and see how the charter actually affects the criteria. And then I really appreciate the comments earlier around, and there were several around the safety and welfare and, sort of whose welfare and, so on and so forth. So I think it's hard, maybe the intention was to leave it ambiguous so that the people who would be interpreting those at any given time would be able to reflect what's necessary or necessarily important to that contemporary moment. Yeah, that's all I have. Thank you.
Okay, Caitlin, can you talk quickly?
Sure. I was just going to make an ask, and I expect that maybe the CPD team is already doing this, but I think it would be really helpful for this group to look at other cities, because every city that reviews zonings across the state has review criteria. And a lot of these criteria are somewhat similar to those in other cities. And but there's others kind of that we could maybe pull and draw from instead of, and I think identifying the ones we struggle with is really good, but then also looking at some comparisons. And I know you've done that in other contexts, but it might be helpful for this group. And maybe that's something you were contemplating and doing anyway.
So Brendan, can you pop us real quickly? We do have a final slide, slides 27 of that. And so we'll just point that out for people. We supplied it, but didn't have enough time to really spend time on conversation about it. But the city has been doing that research, Caitlin, for us to keep coming back to as we move to recommendations. So Brendan, can you pop us to 27 real quick? There we go.
Seeing this now, good.
So it is in your slide deck, Caitlin, that we sent out. We just didn't cover it today because we wanted to have enough time for conversation. So you can see that there's a couple of things there that the final 3 columns that other cities are using that Denver is not currently using. So adequacy of public services, impact evaluation, compatible with surrounding area. And so as we move into other recommendations, we'll be able to see from other cities, how are they doing it? What do they mean by each of these definitions? How does it differ from ours?
I would like to hear more about what impact evaluation means in a future meeting.
Great. Okay, Brendan, take us back a slide, or 2 slides back rather, and remind people of where we're going next.
Thank you, Rox, and thanks again to everyone for joining. Just wanted to remind folks about our 2 upcoming meetings. Both of them are in September, and one of those, the one on the 14th, is that additional meeting that we added. It'll be focused on equitable outcomes, so I think we were kind of getting to that in our discussion today and hope to carry that forward and dig deeper. Also, we will have hopefully that finalized issue identification report posted to the website and shared with you all in case you have any thoughts in regards to that. We really appreciate all of your dedication on this project, and feel free to reach out to me with any questions you have before our next meeting. I hope everyone takes care and enjoys the last couple of weeks of summer.
Great. Thank you all. We're going to stop the recording at this point and really appreciate your time. And we will see you on September the 14th, if not before.